Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So over the coming months, I'm going to do quite a few videos analyzing the Cold War, reviewing some books on the Cold War. So I want to start by looking at a book titled Cold War and International History by Carole Fink. And this is the book that I read in a college class back in 2015, so over a decade ago. And this book was published in 2014. But this book still holds up very well, just because the book has a very different perspective of looking at the Cold War. I know a lot of these sweeping narratives about history that you see in various books, they tend to be hit or miss, but this one is very good. It holds up very well. And the professor that I had in college that used this book to kind of use as introduction to the Cold War, he had a very interesting way of looking at history. He tended to look at history as falling into these natural rhythms, these natural states. And this book does a very similar thing, because it doesn't look at the Cold War as just this struggle against communism versus capitalism. It kind of shows the Cold War as this giant geopolitical reshuffling that happened following World War II and the end of colonialism. So it doesn't really look at the Cold War in the traditional sense that you think of it, US versus USSR. I mean, it looks at that, but it just kind of sees it more as a natural reshuffling that was kind of inevitable following the end of World War II. Because the biggest thing to come out of World War II was not the defeat of Nazi Germany, not the defeat of the Empire of Japan. It was really the end of the British Empire as a major power on the battlefield. The British Empire never was what it was after World War II, what it was before. There was this giant vacuum that needed to be filled. And the obvious two players to fill that vacuum were the US and the USSR. So that's kind of how it shows the start of the beginning of the Cold War. And Cold Wars, as this book explains, are nothing new. There's been Cold Wars all throughout history. Since geopolitics began, there's been Cold Wars going back to ancient times. But what makes the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union very unique is that we now have political ideology and we have nuclear weapons and the ability to destroy the world over several times. So because the two sides have such power through atomic weapons, the Cold War is much more present in everyday life. It's much more something that people experience in their day-to-day, just because it's just such an umbrella over the entire world with the presence of nuclear weapons. Traditionally, when you study the Cold War, usually it begins right at the end of World War II. But this book begins its analysis of the Cold War going back to 1917. Because since 1917, with the Russian Revolution, the West was always very distrustful of the Bolsheviks, of the Soviets, because the West really saw, when the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia, as kind of them being on the enemy side in the way that Germany was on the enemy side in World War I, because they couldn't deal with the Germans, and the United States even sent troops into Russia following the end of World War I. So this tension that we see between Russia, the Soviets, and the West goes back to 1917. And the way this book analyzes the events after World War I, it kind of presents the Russian Revolution and a lot of these tiny conflicts that happened in Poland and Ukraine as kind of this continuation of World War I. This mess that was World War I kind of continued a couple years after World War I, as there was quite a few conflicts in Eastern Europe. And a lot of these smaller nations that formed in Eastern Europe after World War I, they were very fearful of these major powers that they were surrounded by. And the one event that really, I think, represents this fear is when Japan invaded Manchuria, because the League of Nations that formed was supposed to protect the world from having conflicts like this again. And the League of Nations was pretty much powerless to do anything about Japan's invasion of Manchuria. So after that, all these small nations were very, very fearful of what the future was going to have in store for them. So following the end of World War I, the communists come to power in Russia, now the Soviet Union, and they kind of become locked in this emerging Cold War with the West. And during this time period, Germany kind of represents this middle ground between the East and the West, because Germany was defeated during World War I. And Russia and the West did work together to kind of counter this rising German threat in the 1930s. Because in 1935, Russia and the West signed this Mutual Defense Treaty in 1935. So you see them kind of working together despite being rivals. And at the same time, Germany and the Soviet Union also collaborated over the partition of Eastern Europe, over the partition of the invasion of Poland. So you see that the Soviets and mainly Stalin are trying to do whatever is necessary to do whatever is in the Soviet Union's favor. So they're working with both the West and working with Germany to put themselves in the most favorable position that they can put themselves in. And Stalin, even during this time period, sought to suspend the ideological conflict with Germany, kind of just to find a mutual understanding over their position in Europe. So Stalin and the Soviets saw the West, saw Germany as all part of the same thing. It was all the West. And Stalin was doing whatever was necessary to maintain the Soviet Union's position in Europe. So basically you have the Soviet Union in the East, and then the West you have Britain and France, and then you have in Central Europe, Germany. So each of these three sides are basically doing whatever is necessary to maintain their position of dominance in the 1930s, doing whatever they can just to promote their own self-interests. So because of that, there's a lot of tension in Europe during this time period. And between the years 1939 and 1941, you just see this explosion that is World War II, because by the year 1941, you have Germany at war with France and Britain, and now even the United States by the end of 1941. And then in the East, you have, at this point, Germany's at war with Soviet Union. Soviet Union has already been at war with Finland, and then you have at this point in the Pacific, the United States at war with Japan. So during these very short period of time, 1939, 1941, you see the whole world just go to war and get caught up in this major world war. And during this war that was fought, Germany was at war with both the East and the West. The East and the West kind of had to work together to find a common interest to defeat Germany. So World War II from 1941 to 1945 is basically just this long, drawn-out negotiation between the East and the West. So you see this Cold War emerging as World War II is playing out. So while Germany is being defeated, the Soviet Union and the West are basically negotiating how post-World War II Europe is going to look, how things are going to be carved up, and who's going to have control over what areas. And because the West really didn't have a foothold in Europe until 1944, besides being in North Africa, being in the bottom of Italy, the United States really didn't have a strong foothold in Europe until they invaded D-Day in 1944. So for the majority of World War II, the Soviets had all negotiating power. They were the ones right there in the front lines, pushing further and further, and closer to Germany. So it's not until the very end of World War II where the United States and the West finally have some serious negotiating power as far as what post-World War II Europe's going to look like. So because the West and the United States weren't necessarily right in, mainland of Europe until the end of World War II, the Soviets came out on top after World War II. They had the most solid control over Europe that was in their self-interests. And the Soviet Union really solidifies control over Russia's greatest territorial weakness that they have had all throughout history, because the European plain stretches from France all the way to the Ural Mountains. So there's this wide open stretch of territory that invading armies tend to go across to fight Russia, all throughout history. And Germany sits right at this bottleneck, right at this point where the Central European plain is at its narrowest point. So the Soviet Union controls Europe from the Ural Mountains all the way to this narrow little choke point of the Central European plain. So the Soviet Union is just in the best position they could possibly be in following World War II. And despite the Soviet Union and the West working together to defeat Germany, they really were never true allies. They were just kind of strategic allies. And one event in particular that this book highlights that really, I think, summarizes the Soviet Union's position with the West is the Warsaw Uprising. So in Warsaw, as the Soviet Union was pushing west to reclaim Europe from the Nazis, a partisan group of fighters in Warsaw had this Warsaw Uprising where they fought against the Germans within Warsaw. And the Soviets were right there at Warsaw when this uprising happened. Like, they were at a point where they could push in and liberate Warsaw. So when this uprising began in Poland, the Soviets just stood by and let the partisans in Warsaw be defeated. They thought that the Soviets would come in and aid them and help them, liberate Warsaw, but they just stood by. But the Soviets just stood by, let this uprising happen, let the Germans wipe them out. So by letting the Germans just wipe out these partisans in Warsaw, they allowed for the Soviets' political rivals in Poland to be taken out. So this just helped them be in the most dominant position they could be in Poland. There was really no opposition for them in their struggle to maintain control over Poland. And the people responsible for the Warsaw Uprising, they were in contact with the West. So really, it was just a stab in the back to the West, where they just stood by and let these people be, wiped out by the Nazis. So right when World War II was ending, you see that these strategic allies are quickly becoming enemies as Germany is slowly defeated. And there's a couple events after World War II that really highlight this divide that was emerging. And one event in particular is the city of Berlin. So when the Allies were kind of carving up the occupation zones of Germany following World War II, Germany was divided in occupation zones, but the city of Berlin was also broken up into occupation zones. Berlin was meant to be this central place where all of the Allied powers could have a seat at the table to work together in the occupation of Germany. So it made sense in the very early planning stages of how occupied Europe would be maintained. But very quickly, this turned into quite a big problem. As East and West became more and more divided, West Berlin really became this little Western enclave, well within the borders of East Germany. So it really just became this little, pimple on the face of the Soviet Union's occupation of Eastern Europe. And because Germany wasn't really this place where Allied powers worked together to maintain control over occupied Germany, it basically just became two separate nations, East Germany and West Germany, within a very short period of time. So Stalin recognized the weakness of having the Western powers right smack in the middle of East Germany very early on. And he decided that he was going to basically starve out West Berlin, cut off all the roads, and it was just going to let it just starve until the West decided just to let the Soviets take control of it. So the West wasn't going to let this happen. They were going to hold on to their control of West Berlin no matter what. So the Allies had this Berlin airlift where they airlifted supplies. It was just a constant continuation of planes landing, taking supplies to West Berlin for months and months and months. And it was so successful that the Soviets realized that they weren't going to be able to win this. So they allowed the roads to be opened again to West Berlin so they could send supplies in via truck and trains. So because the Western powers were so set on maintaining control of West Berlin, it kind of just solidifies this divide between East Germany and West Germany. So whether or not the Soviets and the West realized this at the time, but the solidification of East Germany and West Germany was much more beneficial to both sides than it would have been to have a joint occupation of Germany, because it allowed them to project much more power into Central Europe. It allowed them to have much more control over these two new nations that formed in what was Germany. Because with the Soviets, because they had much more control over this nation of East Germany, it allowed them to station a bunch of troops there. 500,000 troops were stationed in East Germany as the Cold War played out. So this was very beneficial to them because it allowed them to also have more control over Czechoslovakia and Poland, because they had this huge number of troops right there that didn't need to have approval from this joint occupation to station there. So they had much more control and much more powerful forces right there. So if there was uprisings in Poland and Czechoslovakia, this force would be right there in Germany. They could use to send in there to quell any uprising instead of having to send troops all the way across Eastern Europe, across other nations to get there. They had this force right there. And that benefited them when they had to send troops into Czechoslovakia in 1968. And this emergence of East Germany and West Germany also benefited the West. And the main place where it benefited the West was the maintaining of West Berlin. Having this little outpost within the Soviet Empire was very beneficial. And that comes back into play at the very end of the Cold War. We'll talk about that later as we get into it. But this solidification of East Germany and West Germany was beneficial to both the East and the West. And the other key event that really highlights this division that was emerging in the world after World War II was really the Korean War, because the Korean War was a major miscalculation by the Soviets. By the Soviets supporting China and North Korea in their war against the US and South Korea, it led to this major US military buildup in Asia. The US sent way more resources, materials, and troops into into Asia to counter the threat of communism in Asia. And because of that, the Soviets also had to send more resources and material into Asia to support the communist nations that they were trying to prop up in Asia. So the Cold War in Asia really just explodes because of the Korean War. And this really fuels the domino theory that the US has about how, as nations fall to communism, it's like this chain of dominoes falling where it's just going to continue to spread. So the Korean War really fuels that theory, and that just leads to the US backing all these nations in Asia, the whole Vietnam War. So the Cold War in Asia drains resources, both the East and the West. So you see how the Korean War was really fundamental in that happening. But in my opinion, yes, the Korean War was the clear event that led to that, but this was going to happen no matter what. At some point, there's going to be some event that led to the Cold War expanding into Asia. It was going to happen, and the Korean War was just the event that was the first event to happen that led to this massive military buildup in Asia by both sides. So getting back to this book, one interesting thing in this book talked about that I was already aware of but didn't really think about very much until rereading it this past time was the occupation of Austria. So Austria was occupied, just like Germany, with joint occupation areas, but unlike Germany, the Soviets in the West pulled out of Austria in 1955, didn't have this dramatic division like you saw in East Germany, West Germany that happened in Austria. And there are quite a few reasons for that. The main reason, obviously, was that Austria was part of Germany, but it was really seen as Germany's first victim during World War II. It was the first place that Hitler took by force. There wasn't like an invasion the way you saw an invasion of Poland, but it was a place that Hitler took by force. So it was treated a little less harshly than Germany was treated following World War II. And the other reason that this happened is because when Austria was, when the occupying forces left Austria, it was agreed that Austria would remain a neutral nation. So being right next to Switzerland, it just created this larger neutral bloc right in the center of Europe where both sides wouldn't compete for power, and it wasn't this place where you had to have Cold War play out. So it was beneficial to have this neutral bloc to allow a little buffer between East and the West. It separated Italy from Germany, and it just wasn't a place where both sides could mass troops and have a conflict, Cold War play out just like you saw in Germany. But thinking about this a little bit more, it was political decision to have this neutral place, but it's also geographical. Switzerland was agreed to be this neutral territory following the Napoleonic Wars, and it's partially because of its position in Europe, but also it's because of the Alps. The Alps are right there. The Alps are this natural fortress right in the center of Europe. So it makes sense that you want to have this neutral bloc right at this high ground in the middle of Europe where, it was this fortress that, if you controlled it, it was very beneficial, but if nobody controlled it, it's just this natural buffer right there in the middle of Europe. So you see how geography plays quite a major role in how geopolitics play out in Cold Wars and in Europe and just in general. So it's very interesting to think about how geography is partially the reason why this neutral area is present right there in Europe. Because the Cold War is largely a Cold War over geography as much as it is a Cold War over political ideology. And this is something that probably my professor would greatly agree with, because the occupying powers of Europe, they were basically just trying to put themselves in a dominant position geographically, because Russia, it constantly had this weakness of not having a very solid control over the European plains, because they were all the way over in Eastern Europe, and all these invading armies could travel from France all the way to Russia and have this clear open pathway to get to Moscow if they wanted. So during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was trying to place themselves as far west as they could in the Central European plain to get to the point where you had this bottleneck in Germany. So a lot of the Cold War was just about Russia trying to just have a strategic advantage geographically in Europe. So I think it's interesting to think about how geography is just as major as of a factor in a lot of things as is just politics. So physical geography sometimes is the force that sets things in motion, and you don't really think about unless you really start to analyze what's actually going on. So as the Cold War plays out from the 1950s into the 1960s, you see things continue to heat up. You finally had the Berlin Wall go up in the early 1960s. You had the Cuban Missile Crisis. You have the Prague Spring, where the Soviets had to send troops into Czechoslovakia. You had the Vietnam War. You had the Israel-Arab War. So you have all these events happen as the 1950s go into the 1960s, and things continue to heat up. So it reached this point by 1969-ish where both sides like, okay, we need to cool down. We need to try to work together to find some mutual understanding. So you have this period of détente that happens, this period of understanding between the East and the West. And the event that highlights this event is the Helsinki Accords in 1975. This is kind of the high water mark of the détente between the East and the West. But 1975, that's also the year where things start to also come unraveled. So Helsinki Accords is more of just a marker, just a kind of something that represents this period of détente, even though things start to unravel right after that. It just kind of represents this period where things are starting to cool down. But the major event that I think represents this cool down period ending was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And the Soviets thought that they would have no problem in Afghanistan. I mean, most of the West pretty much associate Afghanistan as being within the Soviet Union's orbit. I mean, it's right there next to the Soviet Union. So the Soviets thought that there would be no major pushback from the West as they aided their socialist ally in Afghanistan. But the opposite happened. The U.S. had a major response to Afghanistan. We poured so much material and weapons and technology into Afghanistan for the Mujahideen to fight back against the Soviets. So the U.S. really made an effort to make sure the Soviets lost in Afghanistan. And a lot of the NATO partners were very critical of President Jimmy Carter's actions in Afghanistan because they saw it as a threat to the time. They saw it as a threat to this cool down period that was happening. Like things were starting to calm down, and President Carter is just adding fuel to the fire by putting all this resources into Afghanistan. But President Carter's response in Afghanistan definitely was fundamental to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which we'll get into very, very shortly. But I just find it very hypocritical of Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy Carter was this person who I think tried to make the world a better place, just to kind of simplify it. Just he wanted to have a lot of positive change in the world. But at the same time, he has the Carter Doctrine. And the Carter Doctrine basically states that the U.S. will use military force to defend its interests in the Persian Gulf. And to me, that's like the most blatant, just written in stone thing that says the U.S. only cares about oil. Like, we're going to do whatever's necessary to defend our interests to have access to oil in the Persian Gulf. And that just really feels contrary to what I think about when I think of Jimmy Carter's stance on so many things. But regardless of that, the U.S. response to Afghanistan was actually very strategic. It actually did pay off in the long run, because the Soviet Premier Brezhnev, he definitely held back a lot in other events that happened throughout the world because of the U.S. response. And so in the U.S. response in Afghanistan, he didn't want to have a similar response somewhere else. Like, the Solidarity movement arose in Poland, Brezhnev held back quite a bit because he didn't want to add tension to the world, with what's already going on in Afghanistan. So you see almost immediately that Carter's strategy in Afghanistan really pays off. So as the war in Afghanistan continues to play out, tensions in the Cold War continue to escalate, and it reaches this boiling point in the early 1980s. Because the early 1980s was much like the early 1960s, where we reached this moment where we might actually have nuclear war. Much like the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 1960s, 1980s had a very similar moment where things almost led to nuclear war. And the one key event that kind of led to things getting much more tumultuous during the Cold War was the downing of Korean Airlines KAL 007 in September 1983. Because this airplane that had taken off from the United States veered off course, and it passed through the Soviet Union in two different locations as it was headed to Korea. So the Soviets decided to shoot down this airline. They didn't know if it was a U.S. military plane, so they just shot it down. And a lot of Americans and people from other Western aligned nations died during this downing of this airline. So this obviously had a huge spike in tensions between the East and the West. And on top of that, 2 months later, in November of 1983, you had the NATO military exercise called Able Archer. And the Soviets misinterpreted Able Archer as the United States launching a first nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. So there almost was a nuclear war. We were within minutes of someone deciding to press that button to have a full retaliatory strike against the United States. Arguably, that was worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was definitely an event that was much under the radar. A lot of people didn't know about it until years later, but we almost had a nuclear war in November of 1983. And Andropov, the leader of the Soviet Union at that point, was very old and sick. So who knows what decision he would have made. He could have easily decided to retaliate, not really knowing what was going on as he was so old and not really with it anymore. So it was this moment where everything could have come undone. But Ronald Reagan was obviously very much aware of what happened, and this kind of led him to want to cool things down. He realized that we can't go on like this. We need to find a way to cool down the Cold War, or we're going to have a nuclear war and the world's going to be destroyed. And a few years after that, a man named Gorbachev comes to power in the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev came to power with a desire to really save the Soviet system, because at this point, the Soviet Union really couldn't compete with the United States. It was falling behind the United States, and with every level at this point, it just couldn't outmatch the United States economically and with the Cold War. So Gorbachev wanted to basically modernize the Soviet Union, and he had this idea of openness and restructuring that he wanted to bring to the Soviet Union. And as much as this was a good thing for the Soviet people, when you bring openness to a very repressive regime like the Soviet Union, it's only going to end one way. And this kind of set in motion a chain of events that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the first place where things began to come unravel were in the Soviet satellite states, because Gorbachev also wanted to kind of open things up within the Soviet sphere of influence. And the first place where things to really break were in West Berlin. I'm not going to get into the whole story of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. It's a whole other video. But basically, the Berlin Wall came down, and the Allied strategy, the Western strategy of staying in West Berlin really paid off, because it really represented this place where it was this little trickle within a giant dam wall. The Iron Curtain was really this dam, and West Berlin was this little point where water was just kind of trickling through. And once things fell apart there and the Berlin Wall fell down, things just continued to open up from there. There's really no holding back the water from the other side of this dam once the Berlin Wall came down. And in my opinion, the United States and the West's decision to stay in West Berlin was the most fundamental, consequential decision of the entire World War. Because, as I said before, the Soviets' goal in the occupation of Europe was to maintain control over the Central European plain up to this bottleneck in Germany. And because the United States was in West Berlin, the Soviets never fully had control over the Central European plain. The United States was this constant thorn in the Soviet side, having this little outpost within the Soviet Empire. So because the Soviets never fully maintained control, it was this place where the West could have an influence in the Soviet Empire. And when the Berlin Wall came down, that was the real point where things just broke and Western influence just poured into the Soviet Empire. So really, it was this point of no return once the Berlin Wall came down, and the United States' decision back in the 1940s to stay there fully paid off, and really, I think, set in motion the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union. And reading about the end of the Cold War, especially in this book, you really see that the Cold War is really, in my opinion, one of the most inspirational moments in modern world history. It's really this moment of reconciliation where visions of East and West really come down, and the world really, you feel like it's starting to heal, and anything is really possible. And it's kind of sad thinking back to looking at where things are now, how much division we have in the world now, thinking about where things were in 1991, where the world felt like it was just going to be at peace forever. It felt like all these divisions were crumbling. And there was this brief moment right at the end of the Soviet Union's history where the United States and the Soviet Union were kind of on the same terms. George Bush and Gorbachev were getting along quite well. And it was almost this moment where we were almost, I want to say, allies with the Soviet Union. We had such an understanding of where things needed to go, and the arms race was ending, and it just, things were just headed in such a positive direction. And one event I think really highlights this, despite it being a war, is the Gulf War. Because during the Gulf War, the Soviet Union was still in existence when the Gulf War was being fought. And the Soviets stood by the United States' decision to go into the war in Kuwait and Iraq, into the Gulf War. So it's kind of surprising that every war that happened during the Cold War was this moment where both the Soviet Union and the United States sent resources to fight each other indirectly. But when the Gulf War happened, the Soviet Union backed the United States' decision. So it's just kind of striking just to see how much things had changed by the end of the Soviet Union. But as much as I think the Gulf War represented a positive thing in the bigger picture of the Cold War, it obviously was a very negative thing for the United States and the world, because the United States in the early 1990s was really the sole superpower of the world. We were the last remaining power that could really project influence in another side of the world the way that had happened throughout the entire Cold War. And the Gulf War really, I think, represents the United States' failure, or at least the beginning of our failure, in that role as a sole superpower. Because in the Gulf War, objectively speaking, it was a success for the United States. We pushed the Iraqis out of Kuwait. So I think we kind of went to our head. We thought we could just do anything. We thought we could push that power further and further and further. And I'll get into in a moment, I'll get to how that really backfired and led to, a failure for the United States. But at the same time that the United States is a sole superpower and trying to find their place as a sole superpower, the East-West relations started to shift yet again. And the place where I think this really represents, where things really shifted, were in the wars in Yugoslavia. Because in the wars in Yugoslavia, obviously one side committed much more atrocities than the other side, but both sides committed atrocities during the wars in Yugoslavia. And in an overly simplified way of looking at it, the East and the West failure to work together over the break of Yugoslavia really led to a lot of these atrocities to occur. The failure to control it led to so many bad things happening. Because both sides were, I think, more focused on exerting their influence than they were in actually maintaining peace as Yugoslavia came apart. Because both sides had a sphere of influence in Yugoslavia, because the Serbians were very close to the Russians, and the West really aided all these nations that were trying to break away from Yugoslavia and the Serbians. Because NATO was, it kind of seems like the way that this author describes it, NATO was really a tool of projecting Western influence into Yugoslavia. And that really antagonized Russia. Whether or not that was the intention, the Russians really felt antagonized by NATO's use of force in Yugoslavia. And I think this one is moments really have to think about where the Russians are coming from. Because during World War II, Russia lost 25 million people in this war. So it's hard to even contemplate how much of a bad memory World War II is to the Russians, much more than the United States. The United States lost thousands of people. The Russians lost millions of people. So you can see it's just a completely different perspective. So having this powerful alliance on their doorstep, waging a war against a nation where they're also trying to project influence, and you can see how it just brings up a lot of bad memories to the Russians. You can see how NATO slowly became seen as a negative thing to the Russians following the break of the Soviet Union. Because there was a moment where things were starting to heal and things were starting to look up, and NATO, I don't think, was as much of an enemy to Russia. But following the Yugoslavian wars, I think NATO was much more of seen as a negative force to Russians. So when I had my class back in college, when I learned about the Cold War, my professor pointed out something very interesting with the Yugoslavia wars. Russia, to some extent, supported Serbia during the breakup of Yugoslavia. And Serbia was also Russia's ally in World War I. So with the West supporting all these nations breaking away from Yugoslavia and Serbia, you see that a very similar divisions are emerging in Europe yet again with Yugoslavia wars, where Austro-Hungarian Empire was at war with Russia, and all these places that are breaking away from Serbia during the Yugoslavia wars are aligned with the West, aligned with NATO, which includes Germany and other parts of the world that were against Russia during World War One. So with the Yugoslavia wars, you see the world starting to fall back into this same division that you saw going back all throughout at least the 20th century in Europe. So the wars in Yugoslavia really represent things going full circle as far as this conflict that began with World War One and played out through World War Two and the Cold War. And the Yugoslavia War is this moment where you see things falling back into the same alignment that you saw right when all these hostilities began with World War One. And at the same time that things are really starting to collapse as far as East-West relations go, the United States really failed to promote a new form of global governance after the Cold War. Because the Cold War, to some extent, was really this post-World War II order playing out. You know, the Cold War was made possible because of the order that was put into place following World War II. And the United States really had a moment where we could have found a new way to build a new form of global governance. But you know, because we were the last superpower really left of this post-World War II order, we kind of took advantage of that and continued to project power around the world as a superpower. You know, now that we didn't have the Soviet Union to counter our projection of power around the world. So to an extent, I think that the United States' failure as a superpower really culminated in 9/11, because when the United States went into Afghanistan after 9/11, there was vast global support for our war against the Taliban, much like the Gulf War. But the Gulf War really, I think, was a moment where we thought we could just keep going forever. We thought we could just keep projecting power. And a lot of forces that were against the United States in the Middle East, a lot of terrorists, didn't like that. And they decided to attack the United States because we were projecting power into they saw as their area in the Middle East. And they didn't want Western influence in that area. And, you know, so there was vast support for the United States in Afghanistan, but the Bush Doctrine that emerged right around, you know, when the War on Terror began, really, I think, was the moment where things really reached that point of U.S. overcommitting itself to the world. Because with the Bush Doctrine, it really stated that the United States had, you know, license to go to war with anyone who promotes terrorism around the world. So it really was this open-ended war that we were going to have against terrorism. And it was really the moment of the United States capitalizing on this position as the only superpower, becoming this global police force that could really just maintain control over the entire world. And it just wasn't going to work. You know, when the United States projects so much power around the world, there's going to be so much pushback against that. And I think a lot of what you're seeing today, you know, with the war with Iran, tensions with China, the war in Ukraine, are all really pushback against the United States overextending its power to try to maintain control of the world. You know, I'm not saying that things are happening in Iran and China and what Russia's doing is right by any means, but it's really just a remnant of the United States' projection as the only global superpower in the world. And it's reaching this point now where this post-Cold War tension is really reaching this powder keg moment where things just feel like they're going to explode, and they could at any moment. So I think where we're at right now in the world is really things realigning after this collapse of the Cold War, collapse of the Soviet Union, where things are emerging again into a similar situation like we saw before World War One. So yeah, reading this book today definitely, I think, hits a little different than I was reading it back in 2015, just because you see where things have gone since then, and you see how much the Cold War really, I think, came to an end and then wasn't resolved correctly. The world order after the Cold War wasn't really resolved the way it should have been, and now we're reaching a point where you could have, you know, a period of crisis, a period of global war again. So yeah, just some interesting thoughts I had to read in this book. Like I said before, this is the first book I'm going to do in my series of doing a bunch of books, a bunch of videos on the Cold War. I have a whole bunch of books here, all looking at the Cold War, which I'm going to dive into in the coming months. But I figured this was a good first one, just to kind of begin looking at the Cold War, kind of have the sweeping narrative, look at the entire conflict, just to talk about it all. And now, as I do other videos and other things, I'm going to look at individual aspects, individual pieces of the Cold War. But yeah, that's it. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.